Hey everyone, welcome today to our webinar, our second live panel in our Think Big series on 2050 City Megagrowth, assessing and addressing the impacts. We are very excited to have you here today as a culmination of this six-part event. Your webinar today is hosted by the International Association for Impact Assessment. We are the leading global network on using best practice for better and informed decision making. My name is Bridget John, and I will be helping to host and working in the back end. But if you see anything or hear anything today that you would like to share, you can see our handles and social media tags there at IAIA Network and the hashtag IAIA webinar. Feel free to shout out something exciting that you've learned or picked up on today. We'd love to have you do that. Before we get started, just a few pieces of information before we get into the meat and the heart of why you are all here today. If you have not visited IAIA's website before or in a while, please feel free to do that. I invite you to check out all of the free resources we have available on the site. There's a lot of webinars on demand, the ones that have happened in the past on a variety of topics, including our first Think Big webinar series, which was on a cleaner, greener COVID-19 recovery. Also, you can find the recordings for all the previous sessions in this 2050 City Megagrowth Think Big series. We have webinars on a wide range of topics. You'll see there ESG, resettlement, also health, biodiversity. It runs the gamut. So they're free for members and non-members alike, so feel free to check those out. I would be remiss if I didn't highlight that IAIA's next annual conference will be taking place in Dublin, Ireland next April 2024. We will be opening the call for paper presentations and poster presentations later in this year in just a few months, but please feel free to check out our website about that. The topic is and theme is on a just transformation, and we're really excited about that. And we do have several online training courses as well as our online professional development program. So there's a lot of great resources there for you in addition to the webinars. And we have many downloadable publications, whether you want something quick and fast, like our fast tips, 2 pages that tells you the top 5 things to know, top 5 things to do, or something a little bit more involved, like our best practice principles series. You can find those online at IAIA.org, so please check it out. Few pieces of housekeeping before we get started. We are indeed recording this webinar. So in a few days, you will receive an email, which will give you a link to that recording. And this is primarily a Q&A, a live panel. So it's your chance to ask questions. Hopefully you've had a chance to view our presenters' presentations already, but if not, there's lots of great things to listen to and ask questions about even in this session on its own. So feel free to ask questions about their previous presentations or about what you're hearing today. You'll see that there is a questions pane in your GoToWebinar control panel. So just send those questions in at any time, and we will be monitoring those on the back end. So at this point, I'm excited to turn our webinar over to our moderator today. Heather M.H. Goldstone will be moderating our session, and she is an award-winning national science journalist with the Woodwell Climate Research Center, which supports sustaining Earth and human systems in a time of urgency. She founded and hosted Living Lab Radio on Boston Public Radio and also hosted Climatide, a U.S. national public radio blog that explores the impacts of climate change on coastal communities. Her research has been featured in many places, including the U.S. National Public Radio's Morning Edition, U.S. Public Broadcasting Service NewsHour, The Takeaway, and PRI's The World. And we're so delighted she agreed to come back and host our second live panel on Think Big, assessing the 2050 City Megagrowth. So Heather, over to you.
Thank you so much, Bridget, and it has been really an honor. I am Heather Goldstone. I'm Chief Communications Officer at Woodwell Climate Research Center, and we are a US-based research and policy organization, really with global reach, though. And while our longest standing and most of our research is focused on natural systems, their role in the climate system and how they might be part of solutions. In particular, a growing area of our research is on climate risk. And in particular, we increasingly have been thinking about the fact that we need to be making decisions in a whole realm of areas, but in particular when it comes to development and infrastructure in a risk setting. And so it's been really wonderful for me to hear these presentations and to get to moderate these sessions on impact assessment and how that field is changing to adapt, to respond to, and help us all address the climate crisis. So without further ado, as Bridget already mentioned, this is really a session for you to ask your questions. I do come from a journalism background, so I could ask questions all day. I've got a couple lined up to get things, to kick things off and get things warmed up. But I encourage you from the get-go right now to start putting your questions into the question feature as we're introducing our panelists, and we will try to get to as many of your questions over the next 70 or so minutes as we possibly can. So to introduce our panelists, I'm going to actually ask them to introduce themselves, give a little bit of their background and their connection to our topic this morning, and starting with Ahmed Sanda. Ahmed, go ahead, pop on your camera and give us a little introduction.
Okay. Hello, can you hear me?
We can see and hear. Whoop, we could see you and hear you.
Okay.
There you are.
All right. Yes, my name is Ahmed Sanda. I'm an impact assessment and system consultant who's been working in impact assessment for about 25 to about 30 years, so to speak. And I run a consultancy firm with about 23 professionals actually working across different sectors in all areas of impact assessment, mostly in Africa. And I also serve as the co-chair of the tech group specifically that engages with decision makers and urban planners. And I was just the immediate past president of the IAIA affiliate of Nigeria. I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to discuss and work and discuss and share my opinion on the relationship between impact assessment and cities development as well as population. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And Ahmed, in addition to being part of our discussion panel today, takes a philosophical approach to things. And so we're going to come back to Ahmed at the end of the event for some closing thoughts. Our next panelist, and also helping on the back end of things, helping to make sure that we see all the questions and ask the right ones, is Garry Middle. So Garry, would you like to pop your video on and give us a little introduction?
Good evening, everyone, or good morning, depending where you are. I come to you from, you probably tell by the accent, from sunny Australia in the middle of winter here. My background is I've been working in impact assessment for about 30 odd years. You can tell by the colour of my hair and the lack thereof. And my main interest at the moment is certainly climate change adaptation. I work with local government, state government on a whole range of climate adaptation measures. We're currently working on a huge project to do with renewable hydrogen, and hoping to get as much of that hydrogen up to the Northern Hemisphere as possible to replace some of the gas that you've got there. So my job tonight, as Heather has said, is to manage all the questions that come through. So I look forward to an interesting discussion with you all tonight.
Garry, when you said middle of winter, I thought maybe you were going to say from the middle of the Women's World Cup, but our next panelist is
yes.
Philippa Burmeister.
4-0, yes.
All right, Philippa Burmeister, over to you.
Hi everyone, I'm Philippa Burmeister. I started my career working for a planning company and then moved swiftly into environmental management. But because of my planning background, kind of retained that more strategic approach. So like most impact assessors, I didn't escape the environmental impact assessments, but did strategic environmental assessment, and in South Africa, what we call environmental management frameworks for some time. Always keen to do and learn new things. In the latter part of my career, I've moved into air quality and more specifically climate change in the last 10 years or so. So 20 years cumulative impact assessment experience, but these days you'll find me very much in the climate change space. I am currently an associate partner with SRK Consulting, where if any of you know SRK, we're a company that has its roots in tailings, but has broadened our horizon to a number of environmental services. So as you can expect, a lot of my climate change work looks at tailings and mining, but from my planning background and the fact that I'm still based in our Durban office, we still do a lot of urban city work as well as planning for municipalities.
Great, thank you so much. The diversity of experiences on this panel is really wonderful. Our next panelist is Willemien van Niekerk.
Thank you, Heather. Yes, and good afternoon from a cold but sunny South Africa. I'm based in Pretoria. My name is Willemien van Niekerk, and I'm a principal researcher at the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in South Africa. I am an urban planner, and I mostly work in the climate change adaptation field, where we work at that nexus between urban planning, spatial planning specifically, climate change adaptation, and so on. I am the lead manager on a project called the Green Book. It is an online website and with various tools. And we developed this website between 2016 and 2019. And it hosts a climate risk and vulnerability profile for every local municipality in South Africa. So that's 213 profiles. And we did our own population projection, so that's where the 2050 comes in. So we've projected the population for every settlement in South Africa between our last census in 2011, 2030, and then 2050. So we have an idea which cities and settlements are the ones to grow in the future, and also what their priority climate hazards are. And then we also propose a number of just generic adaptation actions that municipalities can integrate and mainstream within their local plans and instruments. And all of that is based on the Green Book itself. In the last couple of years, 2-3 years, we've also expanded it to include the metropolitan cities in South Africa specifically. So that's where the Megagrowth comes in for a couple of the cities over 1 million people. And that is just because they are much more dense and complicated than other settlements in South Africa. And so we really delve down into the detail of that, right down to council awards in these metropolitan cities. And that is probably the highest resolution of information that you will be able to find in South Africa on climate risks in settlements. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. Jeremy Gorelick is our next panelist. Jeremy, would you like to hop on your camera and introduce yourself?
So I can do part of what you're asking. I can turn on my mic, but not my camera.
That's right. My apologies. Jeremy is joining us by phone this morning.
And I think that you did a great lineup as far as who you have dialed in, because I, like the previous two panelists, am based in South Africa, although my accent fools people because I'm American by birth. So my background, I'm an investment banker by training. I've raised approximately $5 billion for urban infrastructure around the world for a number of different countries and continents. I currently am splitting my role and my time between a few different organizations. So I'm a senior lecturer at the Johns Hopkins University in the United States, where I lecture at the graduate level on development finance. I also spend a fair amount of my time working on projects for both the World Bank and IFC looking at how we best identify ways to future-proof cities and to make sure that the investments that are being made today are not just for what today's needs are, but for needs into the future. And then the bulk of the rest of my time is spent working on projects for both the British government, for both the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, as well as for the former BEIS, now Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, as well as for the US Millennium Challenge Corporation in designing, again, projects that are made in a way that looks at future-proofing the types of things that need to happen in cities. And so my passion and the reason why I'm excited to be on this is because I look at how do we make sure that not only are cities designed in a way that they are future-proof from a climate perspective, but that we also see that smart money is moving into cities, especially long-term concessional money that comes from development finance institutions. Thank you for having me on the panel.
Yeah, we're really thrilled to have you with us. And last but not least, our final panelist is Wes Fisher. And Wes, I'll just say off the bat, I'm so glad that you reached out several months ago and got me involved in this whole process. So yeah, give us a little bit of your background and extensive connection to this issue.
Thanks, Heather, and it's super to have you serve as our moderator. Before I give you my own background, I just should mention that there are folks who are not part of this panel who, if you may end up having questions for Peter Kroll, who talked about Ottawa, and also Karen Shippey, who talked about informal settlements in Cape Town. And their presentations, I think, were excellent. And I encourage you to make sure you look at those. I am based in Boston. I'm a biologist and geologist by training. I've got 30 years of experience, primarily with small scale environmental impacts, the kinds of for projects, many of them around the world, carried out by non-governmental organizations. I have served as the co-chair of the climate change section. We now have, after about a decade of doing that, more than a decade, I'm stepping down now. We've got 3 new co-chairs, and so my interest remains very strong in the climate change area and the implementation of the climate change, IAIA's climate change action plan, but also very much interested in sort of planetary boundary issues, which I feel like Heather is in the same realm with me, that if you know about what's happening with changes to the biosphere, to species loss, biodiversity, the nitrogen phosphorus cycle, these kinds of things also are of great importance. And I think we're beginning to see real movement towards tackling these issues. That I have a measure of optimism for what I'm seeing, particularly in Europe. So I think that's enough from me. Heather, if you want to take us forward.
I will, and I'm going to ask you actually, Wes, to keep your camera on because I'm going to go to you first, and I would love to just go back through all of our panelists and hear from each of you how you think climate change is altering the role and the practice of impact assessment. What is the imperative for a new role and a new way of doing impact assessment? What are some of the new tools we need? You know, how does the impact assessment field really adapt to the realities of the climate crisis at this point?
Well, we've had through entities like the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia University. We've had a move towards incorporating climate change into impact assessment practice in law, but it hasn't gone very far yet. There is model legislation in New York State that is addressing climate change through the law, but mainly what has happened is simply this interaction on what ought to be in model law. So the EU has also, through their Green Deal, are addressing this in a more significant way, I think, than anybody else. So the EU's Green Deal serves as a model. And I should say that the passage of this new EU law, it just happened. It's very current. The restoration law for nature passed, just squeaked by in the EU. I think that's going to have significant implications for us as impact assessment practitioners and urban planners, because it does now talk not just about mitigating impacts, which is very much a part of the worldwide impact assessment law. Almost every country that has an impact assessment law focuses on mitigation. Now, for the EU, at least, it's also because of the state of the planet, because of the state of what's happened to European Earth systems, this whole move towards safe and just Earth systems. This new law requires a percentage of restoration, or will. It's got a ways to go. There'll be a fight to determine what is truly strong restoration policy. But this could have a major effect on the impact assessment profession and urban planners as we move towards actually implementing the requirements for a certain percentage of restoration, not just in individual projects, but in regions. I've talked too long, but that's that's kind of where I'm thinking.
I think that's an important kind of big picture perspective, and I'm going to invite all of our panelists actually to turn your webcams back on. We can have a bit of a conversation. And Philippa, I might turn it over to you next for your thoughts on how climate change, this is a kind of a theme you've moved toward in your career. So how do you think that climate change really changes the role of impact assessment, or the practice of impact assessment and planning?
So there's definitely three parts to this. Quite recently, we've seen the introduction of climate change impact assessment as a specialist study. Previously, they were all very focused on mitigation, so how do you reduce emissions? But it's now really moving more into something that I think impact assessment to some extent is addressed, but it's really coming to the fore. And that's the impact of environment on the project. So we've always assessed the impact of the project on the environment, but climate change, because of the risks associated with it, are really driving home this concept of understanding how the environment will impact on your project. And then through adaptation, what you have to do to account for those impacts. The other aspect for me, which has always been part of impact assessment, is that integration, but climate change is now forcing us to integrate at an even higher level than we ever have in the past. So where we always used to have specialists assessing various impacts and then your overall impact assessor. In South Africa, we would call them an EAP, an environmental assessment practitioner. Your EAP would then come and integrate all those specialist studies together. Well, now climate change means every single one of those specialist studies almost need to assess current and potential future impacts. And so we're seeing a far greater level of integration and impact assessment. And I think while it can be a little bit scary, it's quite exciting because it's forcing us as impact assessors to really do our job at a whole new level.
Great. Ahmed, I wonder if you could weigh in here with your thoughts on how climate change is changing the practice of impact assessment and planning.
Thank you very much. This is a question that I so much like. It's dear to me because it's some work that I've been doing for some time, especially from the background of seeing the motivation of why people go to cities, right? The motivations are, you can see they're looking for access to quality education, job opportunities, gender equalities, and all those things. But with these opportunities, you'll see a series of issues in terms of population. If you look at statistically, cities are getting bigger and they're going to get bigger. Already, what we have right now based on infrastructure, cities are holding about 50% of the global population, but then they consume more than 67% of the energy. But the statistics that bothers me more than anything is that 70% of the energy related CO2 emissions are actually from the cities, which is totally, the ratio is actually quite high. But now, if you look at the motivation of why people come to city, and that's why tools of impact assessment makes a lot of sense for me. Rather than the traditional tools, we actually look at tools that leads to the motivation, whatever that motivation is, whether it is from a cultural point of view, from an ethical point of view, or from a desperation point of view. They develop some kind of risks and threats to the social fabric of the society. And these are some of the threats and risks that I think impact assessment has some very, very interesting tools when it works with urban planners and minds like Jeremy, I think, who talked about future proofing of cities in the future. I really like that statement. These combination of tools, when they come together, I think they provide the greatest benefit of knowing how to address all of the threats and the risks that are identifiable when cities are developing. So contributions from impact assessment point of view, it's not only related to those access, but it can actually see in addressing the complex issues regarding energy systems. And energy and climate change, they're kind of interdependent. So that's the perspective I see it from. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Willemien, I'd like to go to you next to think about how the practice of impact assessment is changing and specifically some of the tools and practices that are needed in this new context.
Yeah, I cannot comment on that much because I don't really work in the impact assessment environment, but what I can say is that what we do in the tools that we use and when we look at cities, we specifically also look at ecosystem services and the environment, in how the environment can be utilized to build urban resilience, to absorb certain shocks, to protect other environmental assets and resources, and of course also people and other types of assets. So I can just imagine that part of the practice of impact assessments also need to include how the environment can contribute to building resilience against climate change in the climate adaptation sphere. So that's all I can add and think of. Thanks.
No, I think that's a really important perspective, right? Different sides of the same coin to think about risks and also resilience. And we actually, in our work at Woodwell Climate, talk about understanding risk as the first step toward building resilience. So see the two as very connected. Last but not least, Jeremy, I know we can't see you. Want to make sure we don't forget you, and I think you bring a really interesting and different perspective to this, and wonder how you see climate change changing the flow of finance and the the ways that we support planning and development broadly.
Sure, and I've really enjoyed hearing everybody else's perspectives because you come at this from a very different angle from where I sit. So one of the things that I've been really pleased to see over the past 23 years that I've been involved in finance is the fact that this used to be that climate change was a very niche thing, and that there would not even be that much consideration of it from the point of view of some of the development finance institutions who largely would think about this from the perspective of what are we looking at from a social impact perspective, but not necessarily considering the climate impact. One of the things that I've been excited about is the fact that impact assessment ends up being such a critical part of what everybody is looking at. And increasingly, I'm seeing that it's not just the development finance institution. So it's not the World Bank or others who have public funds that they're using in a concessionary way, but that increasingly that even private sector financial institutions, especially those that are making investments at, let's say, the city level, so putting money into specific city projects in the form of lending or participating in municipal bonds that are issued by cities. In all of those instances, we are increasingly seeing that cities are saying that they want to have that sense of responsibility on this. So they, as the seekers of capital, but likewise the sources of capital, especially on the private sector side, are increasingly waking up to the fact that the decisions that they're making today are not just for today and for the financial returns they might experience today, but in many instances, we're talking about long-term financing. And that long-term financing flow will have impact not just on projects today and tomorrow, but for at least the medium, if not long-term. I'm seeing that we're seeing cities, so as an example, Washington, D.C. issued a century bond, so a 100-year bond issuance that was largely targeted at things that are, I would say, a response to climate change. So looking at it from a mitigation point of view, rather than purely from an adaptation point of view, but actually from both sides, do we see that there is these important things coming in. So the adaptation point of view is largely around what does this look like from the fact that we do need to find ways to be smarter from an urban stormwater management perspective. How do we see that cities, in this case Washington, is able to look at what the future flooding plains and future flood issues might be in a city on the US East Coast, rather than just trying to do very short-term financial interventions and short-term technical interventions. So they're always looking from a climate and from an impact point of view, what does it look like today? What does it look like tomorrow? And I feel like this entire climate change conversation, I would say the degree of fluidity, but also the degree of flexibility that people have in talking about this and just generally an understanding of what this means is really exciting and something that I would have never expected would be the leading driver in some of the investment committee decisions that I'm part of about whether or not to put money towards projects. So I see this tremendously changing, and I think that the role of impact assessment is stronger now than ever, especially from a climate point of view. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have one question from our attendees. Dave has asked if we could specifically address how impact assessment is changing in response to climate change, or how climate change is changing impact assessment practices in India and China specifically. And obviously, none of our panelists today are from India or China, but I'm wondering, maybe Philippa, Ahmed, from your practice, are you able to address what's happening there, or maybe Jeremy, you've got kind of that 30,000 foot view and can address a little bit of what's going on in India and China in this realm.
I'll offer an opinion on China. I don't have as close a partnership, but SRK does have an office in China. We've been partnering because there are a lot of connections between projects in Africa where we're working and Chinese development companies. And I would have to say, my experience or anecdotally, I've noticed a huge increase in the understanding and application of impact assessment in project planning, and that includes climate change, but just environmental and social governance in general, particularly around Chinese developer clients. So there's definitely a growing awareness around Chinese developers around the need for ESG, the need to assess impacts, and as part of that, an awareness of their impact through these projects on the environment and climate change specifically.
So from the point of view, I can say is that we have a semblance, actually a good population of climate refugees coming down to the fringes of the cities, and these folks are actually living in floodplains, prone areas. So you can see the direct relationship between climate refugees living in the fringes of the cities where they are floodplains. So as far as impact assessment is concerned, and some of the tools that may be worked in with combination of other tools, you'll be able to dictate the trend and see how these folks or population are going to be able to live or integrate in a way with those city and or those settlements. I'd like to add here, in doing this, I'm particularly interested about the psychosocial aspect of it, the kind of social threats that the societies or these informal settlements actually pose to the city. While we know from a biological point of view, biodiversity increases resilience of an ecosystem, what's happening right now, where cities are an aggregation of so many cultures, peoples are coming in, it actually becomes a threat to the resilience of the city because of the other intangible aspects that we don't look at, which are the psychological threats as a motivation of wanting to integrate forcefully. So there are some tools that have been in the works that with a good combination, you'll be able to predict and find mitigation measures in a way that it's absorbed.
And if I can just throw in, as far as what I've observed in India, I was lucky enough a few years ago to work on the UK government's Smart Cities mission, which was helping Indian cities to think about, again, this question of future-proofing. And we did some analysis to figure out what was, in fact, the smartest and most cost-effective way to get involved from a climate perspective. So looking at transportation, looking at the built environment, so specifically looking at municipal real estate, looking at other key things across both public and privately held properties and many of the other functions that cities have. So the social as well as physical infrastructure side. And the clear determination was that from an impact perspective, there were a lot of things that could be done, but some of these were extremely costly and would require behavior change, whereas others were things that people might experience from a more passive perspective. And so doing that impact analysis, we were able to see that the easiest and most straightforward intervention was around policy on the built environment. So looking at municipal buildings specifically and seeing from an energy efficiency perspective, what was the smartest way to see a cost reduction on energy whilst simultaneously and significantly reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so we were able to see a strong environmental benefit and impact, but also a minimal financial impact to the cities that were leading on some of this thinking. And it in fact led to a more widespread adoption of some of the best practices in energy efficiency from both an operational carbon and an embodied carbon perspective. Thank you.
Great. So I want to encourage all of our participants, all of our attendees to please put your questions in the question function. This is your time to pepper this fabulous panel of experts with your own questions. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for more questions from our attendees, I'd love to pick up on one theme that I've heard multiple of you mention, and that's kind of the need for greater integration, more collaboration or partnership, right? That we can't do assessment or development planning kind of in a silo anymore, and we need to bring different folks, different organizations, different perspectives to bear. And I wonder if we could dig into that a little bit more and get into some examples of what that might actually look like. And Willemien, I'd love to start with you if you're game to think about what does it look like to really integrate Green Book and this idea of environmental services and resilience into a planning framework. Who needs to be part of that process to really make it successful?
Thanks, Heather. Yes, so I think it is crucial that risk information and understanding. You mentioned it earlier, that understanding risk is the base to start from. It's very important, I think, to understand risk. And what we often find is that is left to people working in either disaster risk management or the environmental sciences. But those are not the only disciplines that need to understand climate risk, not even to talk about the adaptation side of it. So often when we do a lot of training with local government and district governments and even provincial and national in South Africa, and we also try to invite a wide audience, people working in different interrelated fields. So that would, just to mention a few, would be urban planning, disaster risk management, environmental sciences, infrastructure, engineering. It's really important to get all of those disciplines together, so that there is a shared understanding of the threats and the risks that climate change and extreme weather event pose to, in our case, cities and settlements in South Africa. So yeah, it is important to raise the awareness across these, that there's a cross-cutting understanding and raising awareness and working from the same understanding. That in the first instance is very important. But you need to have a champion also if you want to mainstream and integrate and collaborate. You need to have someone or a department that is very passionate about driving the climate change agenda within whatever sphere of government you're talking about. So it's important to have that champion. It's important to have a shared understanding. And it is important, when we talk about mainstreaming and integrating, it is important to have a climate change adaptation strategy, and that entails a number of disciplines. So a silo, a loose, just a loose standing strategy, but it is even more important to make sure that elements of that strategy are mainstreamed into various other sectors, instrument, tools, policies, and so on. And as I say, for that you need a champion, you need a shared understanding of what the risks are, of what the main threats are, of what will the future look like. So I think it's also important to understand what certain scenarios within the environment that you're working in, and then to work together to come to certain solutions. So to explore alternatives, to explore solutions, to explore adaptation actions, and these then need to be integrated into the different sectors. And that's then again when people goes from a shared understanding into their own fields again to develop much of the detail with regards to those adaptation actions and solutions. Yeah, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think integration kind of hit a chord with all of our attendees, and we've got some more questions that are drilling into different aspects of these. So we will keep working our way through the panel on the big question, but actually, Willemien, I want to stay with you for one moment because Abdul Musawir asked, what are some of the difficulties, and specifically around cost-benefit analyses, when trying to integrate more climate resilient alternatives for infrastructure? What are some of the challenges that you butt up against?
So we haven't really been able to do quantitative cost-benefit analysis of adaptation actions in our Green Book tool. So we do a qualitative analysis of what those costs are, of what the challenges are, stumbling blocks, and so on. Just as an example, last year during April and May, we had severe flooding in Durban, where Philippa is located. There was some severe flooding in KwaZulu-Natal and Durban city. And we were involved in that to try to determine the extent of the damage. So we're not talking about risk now, but about damage, to try to determine the extent of the damage. And it really took months for a number of organizations working together to realize that it's almost impossible to get to a quantitative cost estimate of the damage, direct damages, never mind the indirect damages. So determining the cost benefits analysis of certain adaptation actions is also quite complicated. It is, there are direct benefits and costs, and then indirect benefits and costs. So we mostly work with the qualitative side of it, and we try to categorize adaptation actions into 3 main strategies. So the one would be win-win, a win-win strategy, where it's just good planning practice, and that planning practice could be environmental practices, it could be urban planning, it could be infrastructure, just your best practices. Those are your win-win solutions. Those are the type of practices that you have to do anyway to ensure that you plan, in this case, settlements to benefit everybody living, for example, in these settlements, and making use of these settlements and working and so on in settlements. So those are win-win situations. Then you have low-cost solutions, and that is where, so I just want to say on the win-win side, it is often your environmental solution, so softer infrastructure, not your hard infrastructure. And then you have low-cost solutions where there is a certain cost associated with implementing that adaptation action. And then you have your high-cost solutions, and those are often your hard infrastructure solutions. And that we would recommend only in certain cases, especially since many local governments do not have the funding available to implement hard infrastructure. In the city of Cape Town, the city built a seawall in a certain suburb within the city of Cape Town, which is amazing. It was quite necessary, but it is a high-cost solution, especially if you're uncertain of the outcome of climate change in cases like that. So I would say it's sometimes, my conclusion would be, it is hard to determine the costs, the quantitative costs of adaptation actions, but it is easier to divide them in certain categories of win-win, low cost, high cost, and bring that in relation to the challenges that you experience on the ground. For example, a lack of funding and a lack of capacity and capability to implement those solutions.
Great, thank you so much. Wes, I want to jump to you. I know you are passionate both about the need for greater integration, collaboration, partnership in this space, and also about the role that Green Book can play in moving us in the right direction. And you are on mute still. We're not hearing you yet. If you're having some technical trouble, maybe we'll come back to you in a moment. Looks like Wes may be restarting a little there. So Philippa, I'd like to turn to you, and maybe you could give us an example of, you've talked about a bit about this integration, the need to bring different types of experts together. We actually have a specific question from the audience about the role of improving waste management systems in kind of development and climate resilience. So, maybe you could give us some examples of what you think really well integrated planning looks like.
So I would have to say, in a nutshell, it's a multidisciplinary team that is actively sought is encouraged to actively provide input. Climate change isn't the type of thing that can be addressed by a single group or a sub-department. It's something that needs to be mainstreamed across all aspects of planning. So if you're looking, I'm going to use a waste management example, but if you were, for instance, planning to develop a waste management facility, for instance, there's some really amazing engineers who have been doing this for years, and it's really important to use that experience and that knowledge. But there are so many amazing new developments in waste management. The opportunity to mine methane out of landfills, for instance, which generates clean energy, but also prevents that methane from being released into the atmosphere. So that's just one example where somebody who would be coming from a very new, innovative approach would need to work with somebody with the years of experience in actually managing these facilities, and the two of them would have to work together to make it possible to realize a waste management facility that can benefit from technological advances without losing some of the practicality that comes with experience. Using eThekwini as an example, moving away from the waste management example, eThekwini has been very successful in planning their cities for a number of years now, insisting that flood lines be designed for climate change. So where in the past, an engineer, a stormwater management engineer, would design for a 1 in 10 or 1 in 50 year flood, eThekwini has for some time been insisting that they design for a 1 in 200 year flood. So being informed by tools like Willemien has developed, the municipality is adapting to this new science by encouraging the engineers to design to new criteria. So another example of how you use tools developed for one group in doing work that you've always done, just to a slightly different criteria. And that particular example has great outcomes, because not only are you adapting to climate change and ensuring that people are safe, but you're also moving development a little bit away from those really critical riparian buffers. So the benefits are twofold.
Wes, are you back with us now? Can we hear you? And we can circle back at this point to some of your thoughts on partnership, the importance of partnership, and the role of tools like Green Book.
I don't think so. You can't hear me, can you?
We can hear you now.
Or you can.
You are back.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to reinforce the value of the Green Book. That I think that for many countries and regions, the use of the Green Book, and all you have to do is go to your search engine and look up Green Book. This tool could be used in many places, and it occurred to me that perhaps China would if they're not already doing something like this, the ability to look into the future when it comes to cities. I think it's a tremendously powerful tool, and it is an example of this integration. The same thing with urban planning, and the other thing that I wanted to mention was I think that the power of the Green Book will also be enhanced through the use of computational, the advances in computational artificial intelligence. This could make this form of analysis even more powerful for urban planners and for IAIA practitioners. That's really what I wanted to touch on.
Great, thank you so much. We're going to turn to a final question from our attendees. And Miriam asked, and Ahmed, I might direct this one to you. How much is local sovereignty, especially land ownership and use, and food security considered when looking at the impact of projects in cities and peripheral regions on the front lines of climate change?
It's very, very important from these perspectives, and it's very, very important. I'd like to say, first by saying impact assessment, the sheer efficiency of scale, using skills, putting them together in solving problem, reduces the cost of solving problem by 2/3 because of these collaborations. But more than collaboration, what we're looking at from an impact assessment point of view is actually filling the gaps, and those are what tools of impacts. That's what they do. But going down to it and relating this to the cost benefits of having these issues around cities and those floodplain areas, using impact assessment tools, you would see things from perspectives that you would never see. Specifically speaking, from a social point of view right now, the indirect benefit or the indirect cost of such situations could really, more than indirectly, become directly related to some of the social crises that we see across major cities, whether it's in Lagos or it's going to be, or it's in Johannesburg and other places. So these tools, as far as understanding the import of impact assessment, which the emphasis, by the way, is on prevention. Years or aeons before that, sets a tone where participation or collaboration and possible cooperation becomes voluntary and reduces the cost by, like I said, 2/3. So that's what I could say about this. Whether it's in Lagos, it's in Johannesburg, or it's in Nairobi, where populations are going to explode within the next 30 years. So we've seen these trends. But what concerns me most actually are the intangible aspects that actually causes the social crises that are becoming high and high and high. And they're kind of interrelated based on the motivation of different people.
Great. Thank you for that perspective. I do want to make sure that we wrap in our invisible panelists. Jeremy, one last kind of question to you, Jeremy, is whether you feel that funding sources in our financial systems are propelling us toward future-proof cities, or are there obstacles there to be doing the sorts of things we've been talking about, these really multifaceted analyses and planning processes?
So it's a great question, and I wish that I could say definitively that everybody is heading in what I would say is the right direction as far as climate change. And the reason why I can't say that is because of some of the recent setbacks that we see in countries around the world, where the financial systems are almost rejecting the thesis that climate change is happening. I look with concern specifically at what's happening in the United States, and the fact that some of the major investors and whether they be on the debt or the equity side, players who have private capital that they're mobilizing, and the fact that they are increasingly saying that there is a bit of a myth around climate change, despite what we're seeing in real time as far as the impact on environment, the impact on weather and unpredictable weather patterns, and all these other things that are happening. I nonetheless see that there's a risk of an even further shift based off of what happens in upcoming US presidential elections and in some of the elections and some of the decisions that are happening across Europe as well. And so I feel that the financial systems, despite the fact that there's an openness to understanding and that there's an increase in the level of the maybe status that we're seeing as far as climate change is concerned, it's nonetheless not an easy solution. And I think case in point, I was just speaking with the Urban Land Institute around some of the, and some of their senior management around some of the questions around how do we future-proof buildings, particularly those that are in high density areas like cities. And one of the things that was raised is that when it comes to designing buildings and looking at design professionals and the decisions that they're making, and knowing that for most of them, the capital required to deliver on these properties comes from private sector players rather than the public sector, when they're doing their design team analyses and whenever there's any need for a haircut as far as the overall cost associated with running those teams, that inevitably the first person who gets cut is the climate change analyst or the person doing the environmental and social, but typically the environmental analysis. And so while we all, I think, appreciate that there is a critical need to have climate change and climate change experts in the conversation as far as some of these design and responsibility decisions as far as that long-term view, when it comes down to profitability, unfortunately, private sector players are still not prioritizing that the way that they ought to. And I only hope that we will see that the public sector and public sector financiers are able to bring the private sector along rather than the private sector dictating and unfortunately starting to cut the question of the need for consideration of climate change and environmental responsibility from their decision making. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. So want to be mindful of the time, and it looks like we have addressed the questions that have been submitted. So I'd like to offer each of our panelists an opportunity for just a couple of moments of closing thoughts, reflecting on everything that we've heard here over the past hour. Ahmed, we will wind up with you. So Wes, I might start with you, and we'll work our way through the panel.
Okay, is my voice back? Okay. Yeah, I'm very excited about an alliance called the Global Commons Alliance. There are a number of ISOCARP is part of it, and the Commonwealth of Mayors is part of it. C4 Cities is part of it, and entities like the World Resource Institute, the Global Environment Facility of the World Bank, ICLEI is part of it, and this alliance is focusing on a sort of several components. One being getting good baseline data, and in that we're talking about both what can be observed from satellite and ground observation, and what can be analyzed using the increasingly strong abilities of artificial intelligence to look at complex data. So in May, there was a paper that appeared on May 31st issue of Nature on safe and just Earth systems. And that paper had 50 authors, and some of those authors, in fact, were from China. But Johan Rockström, who's with the Potsdam Institute and previously with the Stockholm Resiliency Center as lead author, 50 authors looking at planetary boundary conditions, of which climate change, what's happening to climate, what's happening to the oceans, and you've been reading in the paper kind of the disturbing findings with ocean currents and warming of the oceans. This paper lays out in an important fashion different planetary boundary conditions and begins to come to grips with the question of how do we stay within safe boundaries, both and just boundaries for human systems. So I would invite everybody to take a look at that Nature paper. It's in the public domain, May 31st issue. Safe and just Earth system boundaries. I think it will feed into what's happening with the EU and the attempt to come up with science-based standards for financial institutions and for corporations that will get us away from greenwashing and get us to real numbers, real data. And I do think AI, despite our worries about how it can go wrong, AI can also be very, very important in analyzing complex data and getting us to really strong standards for banks, financial entities, insurance companies, and corporations. Big possibilities ahead here.
Great, thank you. Jeremy, over to you for some quick closing thoughts.
Sure, I'll be brief here. I think that there's quite a bit of opportunity as far as, sorry, clearing my throat. There's quite a bit of opportunity as far as trying to find the right ways to make sure that when we're doing these assessments, that it incorporates a number of different players. And I feel like one of the biggest challenges is that we often are preaching to people who already have made that commitment to thinking about how do we go about doing this from the right point of view? How do we go about incorporating impact assessments, incorporating some of this analysis into our decisions? And I think that one of the biggest challenges for us coming in the years ahead, especially from a climate change perspective, is making sure that there's a full buy-in from everybody and that people see that there's not just a hypothetical or academic construct around the fact that if we don't think about impact, that there is maybe on paper concern, but in fact, there's some very real issues that will be faced by everybody in society. But again, from my point of view, working with financiers, that a failure to think about these issues today will actually lead to significant challenges in the future. And so from my point of view, I guess the thing that I would say is I commend all of you for the work that you do. And I think that what we need to continue to focus on and strive to be able to deliver are things that people see as being significantly impactful from a very real world perspective, and that the counterfactual of doing nothing is not just, oh, it would be a shame because this is an impact felt by others, but there's a direct impact on every decision that's being made. And that, again, a failure to consider the importance of that decision by, from my perspective, those financiers who have the ability to start to reject projects that do not have the type of climate impact that we want to see. So those that are beneficial rather than harmful or negative. If we do not do that, then the world will be a far worse place. And again, the work that you're all doing helps to make sure that people are making informed decisions exactly along the lines that we all want to see. Thank you very much.
Well, and thank you, Jeremy, for pointing us in a really active and encouraging direction there. Willemien, I'll turn to you for your final thoughts here.
Thanks, Heather. Yes, I think my final thoughts are that I've been working in this field for the past 10, 15 years, and I know there are many people who doubt climate change and so on. But I think, what we see around us is that the extreme number of extreme events are getting more frequent and severe, and you can't deny that. We've seen that in our country and neighboring countries in the past decades and even the past 2 years, severe droughts, severe flooding, water scarcity, shortages, food security, food insecurity, and so forth. So one cannot deny the consequences, and it won't be ignored. So I would say, I've just seen over the years how many more people came on board, and I think we just need to keep chipping away at providing good information, data, maps, shared understanding of what the impacts are of future scenarios, but also offer solutions, in terms of climate change adaptation, a just transition, and so on. And I think just the idea is just to keep working at it, because people can't deny the severe consequences, and also the many challenges.
Looks like we've lost Willemien on her final thought there, which is unfortunate. Hopefully she'll be back with us here in just a moment. But Philippa, I will hand it to you for your final thoughts here.
Thanks, Heather. I'm going to give you a bit of a real life example. If you hired a contractor to remodel your bathroom and somebody arrived on his own with a screwdriver, you'd be highly suspicious. And I think as impact assessors, we need to channel our inner contractors. And you would kind of expect your contractor to arrive with a painter, a tiler, a plumber, and a big toolbox. So as impact assessors, what we need to make sure we do is we build our toolbox. We go off and we build skills and awareness of the tools that are available to us in understanding what the climatic changes are, what the risks are, and integrate that into the work we do. But we also need to have our team behind us, the engineers, the designers, our project developers, the municipal officials, the planners, so that we have a big suite, a team behind us, because we're not all plumbers and electricians, and we're the contractor. What we need to do is bring all those people together so that they can play their part. And I do believe that's the only way in which we're going to be able to successfully adapt to climate change.
Well, I want to, just before handing over to Ahmed, I would like to thank all of you personally for a wonderful hour. You know, big message for me coming out of this is we all need to expand our personal toolkits and our networks and work together to find win-win solutions for climate resilient cities that are socially responsive and resilient as well. So really an inspiring vision, and I thank all of you. At this point, I think can hand over to Ahmed for his closing comments.
Thank you so much. So I'll start with a fact that is puzzling. Each and every risk that anybody can think about from each and every impact assessment report written anywhere around the world is already happening somewhere in some corner around the globe. That's a fact, right? And the opportunities for impact assessment is that you bring all these lessons, all these facts, and give it a context, whether the city is Lagos, Johannesburg, New Delhi, or Beijing, to be able to use in the words that Jeremy said, future-proof things that may occur. And I would also like to add that the discussions we just had is actually quite stimulating, and it actually shows the relationship between science and policy, which typifies impact assessment, bringing all sorts of expertise and experiences into one room, feeding into policy. And as a final thought, I would be remiss if I don't talk about Star Trek, saying that the discussions we have right now, if this was an intergalactic discussion or competition on how to resolve climate issues and impact assessment, I think Earth would win today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you everyone for what a great discussion. All the panelists, I appreciate all of your time today. I do see, Wes, did you want to jump in on one last comment? We have just a couple minutes left, so it has to be brief.
Right, very quick. We have in Ahmed and Willemien and Philippa and Jeremy, folks who know about informal settlements, about what's happening around, particularly in Africa, but around the world in informal settlements. And we have like 500 million young people in informal settlements who have no access to a proper healthcare, education, employment opportunities. When we talk about safe and just Earth systems, we have to come to grips with that issue in particular, but poverty in general, but particularly what is happening for youth in many parts of the world, India and Africa in particular. And so when it comes to climate change, if we don't focus in on what's happening to youth in under those conditions, it's going to be very hard to deal with the climate change issue as well as the other planetary boundary issues in front of us. That's it.
Thanks, Wes. So thank you all the presenters, and thank you, Heather, for moderating this. Appreciate all of your time today and your opportunities to share with the audience. I'm just going to share just one last quick screen here for you. We do have some upcoming webinars, and so I invite you to stay tuned. On our website, I had mentioned earlier that you can access our webinars on demand, and I just posted in the chat the quick link to that. So you can see all of those for free anytime, and we do have some exciting webinars coming up in future months, including human rights and digital impact assessment, and more in the hopper that we are working on. So stay tuned. And final thank you to all of you participants for being here today and for listening and participating and asking your questions. We're so pleased to have you. Let's continue the conversation. Share out on social media. You see our handles there, but also our II members. Feel free to join in on Connect and talk about what we learned here today. So in a day or two, you will be receiving a link to the recording for this webinar. And as you leave here, you will get a brief survey, and we encourage you to fill that out. It also includes a question asking you, what kinds of webinars would you like to see in the future? We would love to hear that so we can tailor our offerings to make sure we are getting the information out to you that you want to hear. So we know that your time is valuable. We hope that you found this valuable as well. Thank you all for being here. One last thank you to our panelists and our moderator, and we'll see you next time.